Hey everybody, it's Erik Torenberg, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts.
Hey everybody, welcome to Venture Stories by Village Global. On this episode, Erik is joined by his co-host Ray Batra, who is the founder of ShiftUp, a company creating what Ray calls gyms for productivity. They're joined by Austen Allred, who is the co-founder and CEO of Lambda School. Lambda School is a pioneer in the income sharing agreement space. Their computer science education is free until you get a job. By the way, we also apologize for the audio quality of this interview. Austen is a busy guy, so we had to catch up with him over the phone while he was in transit between a couple meetings. Without further ado, here are Austen, Erik, and Ray.
If the quote, Peter Thiel believes that every great startup is founded on a secret. What is Lambda, and what's the secret or insight that has made it successful to what it is today?
Yeah, I think we layer a couple of secrets, but the main one is that we view the main goal of education as eliminating risk. So eliminating risk in the job market for employers, eliminating risk for students is what makes them enroll. And basically, the way things stand right now, going to school is just a very risky proposition, not only from time, but also from money and all sorts of other stuff. So our goal is to de-risk it as much as we can.
Totally. And today I wanted to focus the episode on sort of, requests for startups in education. And so I'm curious, as you navigate the idea maze as it relates to Lambda, but also let's say if you were running a venture fund and the entire focus of the fund was to evaluate opportunities to disrupt education for the future of education, what might your thesis be and how might you evaluate different opportunities?
I mean, I think the most difficult part of any education play is getting market share. It's funny because it's one of those things that everybody uses, but it's so hard to carve out your own niche, especially, when we talk with ed tech investors, ed tech is usually targeting K through 12, which means you're targeting school districts that are notoriously bad at signing deals and spending money. So I would look first and foremost for a business model innovation that helps them kind of cut through that, and a way that you can do something that's different enough that you can get a large market share. I think those opportunities are few and far between in education, but when you hit one, it has the potential to be really, really big.
Right, so that would basically be some people are talking about that as a different framing of ed tech being specifically to schools, through schools, as opposed to consumer learning, like direct to consumer. Like any companies in particular that you see that are doing that super well? Awesome.
Any companies that are doing which side well?
Just direct to consumer, like in terms of that. I don't know, I was basically reintroduced to that kind of idea recently. I think, like you said, ed tech has traditionally been to schools, which are super hard, as opposed to just like bypassing that entirely. Just kind of more of a consumer product as opposed to an ed tech product per se.
I mean, I really think that that's where the future is. There are a couple that come to mind. There's stuff like VIP Kid in China that's, English training, and they have somebody in America that trains, a child that's living in China, and they connect them remotely and automate all the billing and all that stuff. It's one of those things where you have to be careful recommending something, because anything you would recommend has been tried 5 times. You have to find a unique angle. The other hole that I think is super exploitable right now is anything in trade education. So, training people in HVAC or plumbing or welding, stuff like that. If you can find a way to make that scale well, the market is there, both the employer and the student side.
I've heard, I ran into a CEO recently out in Indianapolis who was running a company called 180 Skills, which was basically trying to do like online courses for manufacturing training. And I'm not totally sure. Apparently they've worked with like some pretty cool companies, I think like Boeing or something. They're the only one that I've seen, but if you could do, MOOCs for, and then basically like the last, the last mile of that training, the last quarter of it might be on the job. But if you can get people to training, scale it, and then cut them to employers, interesting.
The hard part about those, it's just, is it VC backable in the sense that, like, could that become $1 billion company? It could. It would have, a lot of things would have to really fall into place to make that happen and to scale. So there's, the brick and mortar problem as well, which most startups don't have to even think about. But if you're training somebody to be a plumber, it's really hard to do that in a virtual environment.
Right. I mean, it's funny, that's what Shift Up does, right? We're sort of going the opposite direction where, to some extent, where I think that we're basically betting that there's a lot of people out there who basically really want or like highly prefer in-person communities rather than just like learning online. And even though, spaces aren't, it's not just virtual, it's actually in person, but, could we become, could you have a WeWork for learning, a WeWork for education? I think there are definitely some other people out there trying it as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I mean, to some degree, WeWork wants to be that, right? It's interesting if you look at like the history of code schools, a lot of them either started out as co-working spaces or they started as code schools and became a co-working space. There's kind of a tight marriage between those two, and that those business models can interoperate with each other fairly well. I know that there's got to be something there in real estate. That's interesting.
Totally.
Also, can you talk about what other business model innovation you've seen within education outside of Lambda?
I mean, I think pay for success generally is becoming more and more popular. I mean, I think that a lot of education for a very long time was just selling courses. So MOOCs came along, the Udacity, Coursera, Udemy's of the world, where, now instead of going to college for 4 years, you can buy a single course for $800 or for $10 or for whatever. Then there's the plural sites of the world that take those courses, get a huge library of them, and then go sell them to enterprise. I think that's probably the easiest way to get money is through enterprise somehow. A company called Guild Education, which is fascinating, and they're basically college classes as a benefit. So they partner with various universities, and then they go out, and so they build this big library of digital classes, and then they go sell that to an enterprise as a package. So if you work at Walmart, for example, you have this, you can attend all these university classes, and as long as you attend under these ramifications, then you don't pay anything. So kind of education as a benefit, I think, is really interesting. We're working with a couple companies that are like, hey, we want to train our entire X team to be data scientists. So can you, we'll just keep them on staff, but we need them to understand the basics of data science. We'll just pay you N dollars per student and have you guys do that, which isn't really our bread and butter, but we'll do from time to time. I think that model is interesting as well. And I think a lot of the code schools will start to push that way to company-funded, employer-funded education as opposed to consumer.
Yeah. What have you learned at Lambda about how people learn or otherwise that you can apply elsewhere? And as you think about the future of Lambda, like, could you see yourself going into medicine or going into law or where else could you expand? Yeah,
I think the most important things are, because we are based entirely on success, we have to make it work for students, and we can't get into a world where we say, the student just didn't work hard enough, the student didn't try hard enough. Yeah, so we really have to make sure that our students are successful. And I think one of the most difficult aspects of learning is actually not the education side, but the other stuff, finding the time and the money to just be able to put your head down and focus. And then knowing what you should focus on when that's happening is much more difficult than I think the average person would assume.
So for that, and that's when you just launched, right? I think in the last month, stipends, right? You're paying stipends for people. I know you've been trying to get housing for folks as well.
Yeah, so we basically, we removed the tuition aspect, so you don't have to pay us a big lump sum upfront, which is awesome, but you still have to find the time. So yeah, we have living stipends that we're piloting. We have housing that we're piloting. And it's really just, how can we abstract away all of the other challenges that someone would encounter when they're trying to switch careers? In an ideal world, 5 years from now, someone will show up at Lambda School. They'll show us that they're capable and talented, and we'll just take care of everything else. We'll pay their bills. We'll pay their mortgage. We'll do whatever it takes to get them there, and then they pay it back on the other side. And I think there is some subset of society for whom it's just a really difficult proposition if that's not available.
Totally, and that's how education should be.
Yeah, in an ideal world, yeah.
5 years out, 10 years out, how do you think about sort of the different directions you could go, and how do you think about what you need, but what needs to be true to pick an either? Like, what forks in the road do you see coming in the future for Lambda?
Yeah, I think 5 years from now we'll have a dozen or two separate verticals. So most people think of Lambda School as a software engineering school. I don't think that will be the case. thing that we have to be careful about is, as a school, we're taking on all of the risk. So we have to make sure that it works on the other side. And we're doing that really well on the software side. But as you add more tracks or more verticals, you have to solve every part of the equation for all of those verticals. So, getting the admissions right, so you're selecting the right people, getting the course right so that it's what people need to be taught, having hiring partnerships on the other side, or at least some way for students to get hired. And that looks pretty different industry to industry. So our main cause is to, industry by industry, break that down and solve all those parts of the equation, and then just kind of build on the advantages that we've already created by making it work in the first place, really.
So follow up on that. You mentioned that, Lambda's making bets on people, right? And I think you mentioned in some other interviews that you're focused on helping, the very talented, very smart. I'm just curious, from whether it's Lambda or somebody else in this whole space, like what about everybody else? Like what is the solution for those who aren't going to get into an elite boot camp?
Yeah, I think, not the entire world is going to become a software engineer, but I would guess that if you look at, the population from an economic perspective, probably less than 10% of people are actually at their true economic potential. If you put a little leverage and a little money behind most people, I would imagine you could increase their income. So software engineering is just the obvious place to start, because you're moving people to, in a very short time, to a very high paying role. But the model works for nursing. It works for psychologists. It works for guidance counselors. It's just not the same margins. So you obviously start where there's the more obvious opportunity, and then we'll kind of work our way backwards to, I think maybe 20 years from now, we might have every career track you could possibly imagine, and you can just do it. You just have to be careful as you're doing that you don't overextend yourself, which is what I am prone to do. So.
And do you see yourself staying in all these different verticals entirely online, or do you see yourself for some of these training areas having sort of in-person trainings?
Yeah, there will probably be an in-person element eventually, but that's like asking Amazon, if they're going to have an in-person element. Of course they will eventually, but it's just so far down the priority list that they're getting to it now 20 years later. It might come sooner for us, but that's not, we're trying to actively avoid that right now.
What do you spend most of your time thinking about?
Right now I spend most of my time thinking about hiring and how to get the right executives on the team, because I'm not in the weeds anymore, really. We've got full-time, we've got almost 40 people, and then part-time, we've got another 80. So I don't even know all the students' names anymore. So for me, it's mostly just getting the right people that can drive the right programs and make sure that all of the different systems and pieces in this very complex business model, that none of them are failing. Because if any single piece goes wrong, then the whole thing just crumbles. So I just kind of feel like I'm watching this machine, trying to make sure that nothing is jammed up and that everything can, is still spinning, so I can hit the gas even harder, basically.
You discussed in a previous podcast that Lambda is a human psychology company disguised as an education company. Can you unpack that? Yeah, I think we do. Our curriculum is really solid. But most people, the curriculum isn't what makes you win, right? The curriculum is out there. You can find a class for JavaScript. You can find a class for, C. The thing that makes us win is that we help people do the mental work that it takes to go through that stuff. So, if we just had if we put our curriculum self-paced and it was just, okay, everybody go for it, I would guess we would have a 3%, 5% completion rate. But by building in the right social infrastructure, the right instructional design, the right who's working with whom at what time, all that stuff is critically important in an entirely online course, because, especially one that's free up front. So if a student closes their laptop and walks away, that's it. So you have to try to make students learn, which is, I don't think it's a natural thing to do for a lot of people, at least when they come to us. I don't think it is.
It's interesting. I mean, for Shift Up, what I'm doing right now, it's, based on a similar premise, in the sense that we're not, at this point, we're not creating our own content. We're curating content. We don't think that that's the difference maker, but we basically provide structure. The difference, I think, is structure and coaching and accountability and all these sorts of things. But we're doing it in person. And I'm curious, from your perspective, for whom is online fine? Like who does it work for? Online versus in person, or or do you think that online is fine for everybody? I think in the past you've mentioned you're a firm believer that online is a better experience than offline.
Yeah, so we may disagree on that. I mean, it's certainly easier to learn in a physical classroom if there's not proper instructional design. So in my mind, basically the physical world gives you all of these, like, you can just glance at somebody and see what they're doing and you can see the emotions on their face. That's easier to do than in an online world. So you have to build in instructional design and software in the background. It's very difficult to make an online class work, but when it's working well, the nice thing is that it's instantly scalable. You can have people, jumping all around. We can have a class of 1,000 people, and then we can subdivide it into groups of 8 with one click. And then we can see what everybody's saying to everybody else. We can run that through a machine learning algorithm. We can see who's struggling, and we can do all that instantly. You can't really do that in a physical space. So I think the key is, do you build the infrastructure that's required to make online learning really great? Or do you just try to take what works in a physical classroom and put it online? I think that's destined to fail.
I mean, I would, my thought on this is that you have, for folks who are like actually highly determined to get jobs, that's a lot easier for them to make online work. But if you're talking about people who might just be wanting to like learn a code just to be more digitally literate, or, it's just some sort of like, to some extent, perhaps lesser levels of motivation, that just wouldn't work. Or is that, I mean, I guess that's what we see anyways. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that. If somebody's highly determined to get there, then, they'll make the online work.
Yeah, that could be true. I mean, our sample is only the people that are trying to make that career switch. So I can't speak to casual learners or people who are less inclined to do something. And, to be fair, again, we do filter for people that are to some degree self-disciplined and committed. If we took a random sampling of Americans and put them through our course, it would probably be difficult. So we have to, you have to be mindful of all that stuff for sure. As far as how to help someone who's unmotivated learn, that's a difficult challenge that I don't know how to solve.
Yeah, I mean, from my experience, it's more that if you're using digital learning, if you're using online learning, like it's almost, a prerequisite that you have to have some level of motivation or a reason why to do it. And if you don't, typically people's eyes just glaze over. So that's something that I've noticed.
Yeah, I think some of that is the case. I think some of that is also just, we basically recorded a professor talking to a camera and then put it online. And then we're shocked that people don't watch the whole thing. That's not surprising to me. Like, if there's not any interactivity, if there's not any back and forth, asynchronous is probably 10 times as difficult to make work than synchronous in my mind. But yeah, you're probably right. It probably does take some level of, self-determinedness. I would say that, if you take the average MOOC and they're getting a 2 to 3% completion rate, if you took that same course content and built it into the proper instructional design with, synchronous aspects, I don't believe that it would remain 3% completion rate. I think that we basically did a really crappy job of putting courses online, and then we blame the online aspect instead of the crappiness of the courses.
Also, can you talk a little bit more about how you try to make the online learning feel like an offline learning? And I'll also ask that in the framing of, you've mentioned how you're sort of unbundling college. There's a liberal arts component, there's the sort of network, community, school spirit component, and then there's sort of the trade school component. That's the one you're focused on, and you're not really focused on liberal arts. Have you sort of done away with the network or school spirit or community, or how do you think about incorporating that at Lambda?
No, I think we have that in spades, actually. So, students spend all day with each other. They're video conferencing all day. They're Slacking all day. They're working all day together. So that, I think that's what's missing from online courses, actually, is we just took, here's the lecture and we put that online and we thought that that's what caused learning. And really, that's not the case. Really, it's working with the people around you that makes it really special. It's, the interactivity, that kind of thing.
Well, is there anything more besides synchronous that you have at Lambda that sort of differentiated that adds to school spirit or community? Or
Yeah, I mean, as far as instructional design goes, we do a lot of stuff. So, for example, we work backwards from objectives, and so each week we have what we call a sprint, and at the end of each week on Friday we have a sprint challenge. If you don't pass that sprint challenge, instead of pushing you on into the next class, we just roll you back and you do that week again, and we form a new cohort of people that are going through it for the second time and assign you more help. So that's something that would be incredibly difficult in a physical classroom, because you can't infinitely subdivide classes and you can't scale instructors into multiple physical locations. But in an online world, that's easy. So you can do mastery-based progression, which has been shown in pedagogical study after pedagogical study to be more effective, but it just doesn't make sense really in a physical environment unless you have an infinite amount of money. So there's a lot of stuff like that just really makes, the scalability makes it special.
Well, we do mastery-based learning too. So basically our students we don't have like a specific start and stop time. That people are basically jumping in when they want to. They're moving at their own pace. They're kind of going through, and when they take assessments every month, and when they're done to some extent. I know it's not exactly what you're saying, but I think we're trying to incorporate that too.
What's the best critique of ISA-funded education and training models that you've heard, and how do you respond?
I'll give you the best critique and the worst critique. The worst critique is that it's indentured servitude, which is insane to me, because you can pay us $30,000, the income share agreement goes away. We don't force you to work anywhere. We don't force you to do anything. You just, when you're making enough money, you pay us back, as opposed to a loan where you'd pay us back no matter what. That's the worst critique. That's not what you asked for. I just wanted to throw that out there. The best critique of an income share agreement is either that it's based on pre-tax revenue that students have to pay post-tax. So, for example, if you're making $100,000 and the percentage on the ISA is 10%, you have to pay $10,000, but it's really important to educate students that it's 10% of pre-tax, which may be more of post-tax. And, of course, you could, if you ran off the rails, have an income share agreement that's 99% for 5 years, or 5% for 80 years, or something egregious like that. So we hope that regulators come in and draw some, guidelines, the same way you wouldn't want somebody to be lending money at a 10,000% APR or something like that. That's probably the best criticism of the income share agreement. It's a relatively new asset class, and not everybody fully understands what that means when they're getting into it.
One follow-up on that. When you think about like ISAs for skills training and to get a job, it seems to make perfect sense because the incentives are completely aligned. And I guess this kind of goes back to what you think is, the purpose of higher education. If it's purely to get a job, if it's purely to do the skills, then sure, then those incentives are aligned. But I guess, like, what do you see the applicability for ISAs in terms of colleges more broadly and then part of that is, like, what do you think is the purposes of college? Is it purely to get a job? Are there other aspects to it, or what should it be?
Yeah, the reality is right now colleges are this huge bundle of, you hang out with your friends, you go get drunk, you go to football games, you go to classes, you get a network. It's like 10 different things. And one of the difficult things about, all the startups that try to replace the university education is you try to do 4 of those. You try to figure out which aspects are the most important and which you can kind of leave off. We're basically saying, we're not a university, we're a trade school. And our only purpose in life is to get you a job, and that's it. And we have nothing against liberal arts. I love Shakespeare, I love Proust, but there may be different time and place for that. And it may not make sense for every person to pay $40,000 a year while they're reading Shakespeare. So we intentionally say, we do not have a sports team. We do not have the party lifestyle. And most of our students are older, either have done that, have explored the world and have found themselves and now have a family they need to put food on the table for, or they, find that in other ways. So I think that's probably one of the main differentiators between us and The other would be college replacements, is that we are just laser focused on job training only. And that, to be fair, coming back to the income share agreement point, it may be true that an income share agreement really only makes sense in that environment, or it makes less sense in the traditional university environment. That's okay. In that instance, I would argue that not every single person should be going to an expensive university for 4 years, which is blasphemy in the US right now. But I think it doesn't make sense that everyone is forced down that very expensive path.
You mentioned that in a tweet the other day that Lambda looks like a charity from the outside, but really you're more like a hedge fund. Can you unpack that?
Yeah. So our average increase in income per student right now is over $47,000 a year. From the outside, what people see are the ridiculous success stories that we have. I was working in an Amazon warehouse. Now I'm a software engineer at Uber. I'm making 7x what I was, 6 months ago. What is really happening is we have kind of inputs, and those are people, and then we have outputs, and those are people making more money. And our job is to make that as streamlined as we can and take a cut. So we basically are playing large-scale human arbitrage, moving everybody to the highest point of income that we can get them to, and then we take a cut for doing that. So, not very many institutions ever have tried to, if you think of hedge funds, they're always looking for an arbitrage opportunity where, you can buy the same product low and sell it high, or there's something that's off in the market. We're basically a large-scale bet that human capital is just mispriced all over the place. And if you apply a little bit of leverage and a little bit of training, a little bit of cash, you can move that person from making $30K a year to making $80K a year. And then they can pay you $30,000, and it's still a win for literally everybody involved.
So to that, I'd ask, why do the schooling at all, and why not instead focus on an AngelList or Kickstarter or hedge fund just for people in ISAs? And separately, do you think that a company just doing that today could make it work?
The reason that we're not just a finance company, full stack. Like, I wouldn't pay to another boot camp in exchange for an income share agreement, because I don't know what's happening inside that boot camp. I'm not getting the data back out to help inform my decisions later. I think you have to do all of it at once. You have to do every step of moving someone from low income to high income and optimizing around that, or the financial model just starts to break down.
Yeah. So sort of in closing from my end, I think the question I ask you is, I'll sort of phrase it this way. What sort of schooling do you want your kid to have? K through 12 and higher ed? Will they go to Stanford? Like, what will their education look like, or what do you want it to look like? Yeah,
that's a really good question. I mean, I think it depends on my kid, honestly. Like for me, I went to a traditional university for a year and a half, and I just hated it, and I got nothing out of it. That said, I've got family members that just loved their experience, and it was the best thing ever. They loved that it was broad, and they had this whole experience. It just wasn't for me. So I think it depends on the personality type and what the goals of that person are. I think there are people that, if you're a billionaire and your kid wants to spend 4 years in Stanford, there's no reason not to do that. I don't see Lambda School as competing with Harvard or Stanford or trying to do what they do. I see us as, you're 30 years old and you're working in accounting and you're making $50K and there's not a clear path to making 70, and you want to create a better life for your family. That's where Lambda comes in. So we just fundamentally serve a different purpose, and the purpose that my children are looking for, they should go to a school that aligns with that purpose.
The best football team possible.
Yes, exactly. Optimized for the national championship. I was gonna say, I'm 5'6", my wife is like 5'3". I can guarantee you they won't be playing football in the national championship. So maybe they can be fans.
Like looking out 5 years out, 10 years out, do you think there will be a change in the way that we pay for education as a country in terms of, will some of the Title IV stuff change? Like, do these schools sort of have monopolies on alternatives? Like, how do you think the market for higher education will evolve over time?
Yeah, I see accreditation right now is very black and white. You either have Title IV or you don't. And if you have Title IV, you can print unlimited amounts of money and students have unlimited amounts of money coming in. And if you don't, you have zero. I think that will become more of a gray area, but then I have learned not to bet against the government saying the same, generally speaking. So I don't know what will happen there. It could just be that, nothing changes and we keep basically the taxpayers keep on eating the losses on default. But it seems like there's a shift happening even right now where the more expensive schools are seeing their enrollment decline for the first time ever. And people are starting to become price sensitive. And everybody you talk to knows somebody that has 6 figures in student loans and not a prayer of paying them off. So I think we'll start to see a shift pretty soon here.
Austin, I'm curious, with applicants to Lambda, what are you seeing as like the biggest bottleneck, or like what's the biggest thing that's holding back people from being ready to get into Lambda?
I feel like we can solve for everything except for hustle. And if you're not willing to put in the time and if you're not dedicated, there's just nothing we can do for you. So our main filtering is just like, will you show up every day and do the work? And if you'll do that and you're of average or moderate intelligence, you'll probably get in. The number of people that do that is shockingly low. The nice thing is that, to me, the world feels pretty meritocratic. I know it's actually not, but even a student from the most ridiculous circumstances, if they'll show up every day and do the work, they get hired. Of course, the hard part is getting to that point where they can do the work. That's what we're working on solving.
I mean, to bring this podcast full circle in closing, will Peter Thiel's vision for that higher education will be the next great big bubble and will be totally disrupted? Will that be true, or to what extent will it be true?
I think it's inarguably a bubble. The question is, will it pop or deflate?
Yeah.
I don't see a way that it deflates because the federal government is rolling into our taxes, basically. Only way it would pop is if something changed in the way that student loans are granted. If any of that happens, then it starts to get really interesting. Clayton Christensen has said that, the next 10 years, half of colleges will go bankrupt or whatever. I think that feels extreme to me, but you make one change in the student loan legislation and that happens. So we'll see.
On that inspiring note, Austin, any last plugs in terms of where people can follow Lambda, follow you, and what they should stay tuned for?
Yeah, I'm Austen Allred on Twitter, or go to lambdaschool.com and take one of our free classes.
Awesome. Austin, thanks so much for coming on the podcast with Ray and I. This has been a great episode.
Yeah, thanks, Austin.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. Please hit us up at villageglobal.vc/network catalyst.